Today programme on BBC Radio 4.
Now, when she called the election, Theresa May presented it as the Brexit election. But in Scotland, the leader of the Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, is framing it as a chance to vote to stop what's known as Indy Ref 2. In response, the Scottish National Party is staying, it seems, rather quiet about their plans for a rerun of the 2014 independence referendum. We'll be speaking to their Europe spokesman in just a second. But first, let's hear from Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor. How is independence, the question of independence, another referendum, playing in this election, Sarah?
It's dominating the election. If it's the Brexit election, as you say, down south, it's the independence election up here. And that's because Nicola Sturgeon called for another referendum on Scottish independence back in March, putting it uppermost in voters' minds. But as you say, there's something of an argument between the SNP and the Scottish Conservatives about whether that's what this election should be about. They both accuse each other of being obsessed by independence at the expense of other issues and policies. The Tories claim the SNP's constitutional preoccupation stops them getting on with the day job, as they call it, running Scotland's schools and hospitals. But the SNP say it's not them, it's the Tories who are totally obsessed by independence. It's really interesting to look at their literature. Tory leaflets that I've seen have the word independence in huge capital letters right at the top with the message, "We said no and we meant it." Pick up some SNP literature and you'll see they don't mention independence at all. They talk about the SNP being the only real and effective opposition to the Tories in Westminster. They don't talk about another independence referendum.
That is presumably because there's a little bit of nerve, Sarah, that if the SNP just go backwards a little, which after all they did in the local elections, or rather the Tories made advances, that Theresa May will use it as a way of saying, aha, the people don't want another referendum.
Exactly. If this election is framed in Scotland as a referendum on whether or not to have another independence referendum and the SNP's share of the vote or number of seats declines at all, then people can seize on that and say it's a verdict on Indy Ref 2. It shows that the Scottish voters don't want another independence referendum. And the SNP have good reason to be worried about their vote slipping back, because it was so high in 2015. They had an astonishing result 2 years ago. They won 56 out of 59 of Scotland's seats. It's such a high watermark. It's hard to imagine how they can possibly repeat or even beat that. And so they are concerned that any slide from that incredibly good result will be used by their opponents to say people don't want another referendum.
Sarah Smith, thank you. Let's speak now to Stephen Gethins, the SNP's Europe spokesperson. Morning to you.
Morning, Nick.
Stephen, do you still regard the independence referendum as being at the heart of this election?
Well, let's not forget that this election is about electing MPs to Westminster. Now, while we are, if you're going to talk about the constitutional situation, while we are part of the Union, big decisions get made about Scotland's future in terms of our future relationship with Europe, pensions, tax, how much money you can spend on public services in Scotland. Westminster is hugely important in terms of the decisions that are made. And that's why we are campaigning very hard for a strong group of SNP MPs, a strong voice for Scotland at Westminster.
You don't think it's at the heart, independence? You don't think that's what it is?
Well, I don't think it's a great secret that the SNP is in favour of independence. I don't think
you know why I'm using the phrase, because the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, at the beginning of the campaign said that independence was at the heart of the general election campaign, and now you're audibly getting a little bit nervy about it.
Not really. I mean, independence is very important. It's not a secret that it's the SNP's policy. But do you know what's interesting about the Tories and what they're talking about? And the Tories are hitting this campaign hard, and I know that from my own seat in North East Fife, where they're hitting it very hard. It's interesting that this is a Westminster election based on the record of a Tory government, because after all, we're electing a parliament at Westminster who will hold any future government to account, and they don't want to talk about their own record. Now, I'm not surprised the Tories don't want to talk about their own record, but look,
I'm surprised you don't want to talk about the words of your own leaders. Alex Salmond at the same event with Nicola Sturgeon.
I've just talked about independence when you asked about it.
Let me just put another one to you there,
sure,
if I
okay.
could. Alex Salmond at the same event said that what the general election was about, and I'll quote him, was the right of the Scottish Parliament, not the Westminster Parliament, mind, the right of the Scottish Parliament to hold a second referendum. So do you now believe it doesn't really matter for another independence referendum exactly how Scots vote in Westminster?
Well, the Scottish Parliament voted, and remember the SNP's in minority administration, so to reach out across other parties. First of all, the Scottish Parliament voted to keep us in the single market, and the Scottish Government offered a compromise. And that compromise was rejected. So in the context of Europe, which is very, very important, will have a big impact on our rights, responsibilities, and all of us. This next Parliament will have a huge impact, and the only people making a positive contribution was the Scottish Government on
what
that.
About Alex Salmond's words? This election is about
words,
the right. Yeah,
in terms of Alex Salmond's words, of course a stronger group of SNP MPs down at Westminster will be holding the government to account to respect the decisions that are made in the Scottish Parliament. I would absolutely urge, and that's something, look, again, me and all of my colleagues have urged them to respect the will of the democratically elected Scottish Parliament. And that's again something that we've said frequently. But it is striking that the Tories don't want to talk about their record because it's so woeful. Remember, you talk about the day job.
Let me just put to you what Sarah Smith said, because I want to give you the chance to reply. What she was saying was, you've got a bit nervy. You've got a bit, what people used to, Mrs Thatcher, I think, used the word frit, because you're losing votes. You think the Tories are gaining votes. I mean, of course, you'll defeat them very easily. Everybody expects that. And you don't want them to be able to say, aha, the Scottish people don't really want another referendum.
Actually, on that, and I picked up something you said earlier on there, Nick. The SNP increased its number of council seats. You said we fell back.
I corrected
Actually,
myself, but thank you for doing it again. No,
but we increased. We had a good election result last week. You know, I mean, the Tories did well. North East 5, I'll admit it, they did well. We still beat them in North East 5, but they did well. But look, there's a clear choice in this election. Do you want a strong group of SNP MPs? And remember, we were described as the effective opposition, not by the SNP, but by commentators, as the effective opposition to the Tories in the last Parliament, providing that strong opposition. And that's really important. It's important that we respect the will of the Scottish Parliament. It's also important that we have a strong voice in terms of pensions equality. And it was the SNP who were doing the research, doing the work in terms of WASPI and in terms of pensions fairness. It was the SNP who were doing the hard work in terms of standing up for EU nationals, standing up for our universities and research in terms of the European debate.
Just to find one on that, if I may.
So, go on.
Yeah, on your impact in Westminster rather than independence. Now, the First Minister travelled down to London to make the point that she thought there was a role for cooperation in Westminster afterwards. Yeah. How do you think that will operate? The Labour Party are desperate, of course, for the notion that there'll be a coalition of chaos, a sort of Tory propaganda soundbite. Won't happen. What do you think could happen, though, if there's a decent block of you, the SNP at Westminster, and a reasonable, if it is an opposition presence, what can you do?
Well, do you know what's interesting about the SNP is that we've actually got some experience of these situations. When the SNP was first elected in 2007, we had 47 seats, Labour had 46 seats in a parliament of 129. Yet we got 4 budgets passed all sorts of legislation, free tuition, all the prescription charges, all these really important bills were passed. And we had to work with other parties in that minority administration. And something that we've done, something I've done as a member of Parliament, say on Europe, where we can, and we can't always. I've reached out to colleagues in the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats, where we work together on Europe and on the Labour benches, to try and get a cross-party consensus.
Stephen Gethins.
This whole thing about Westminster, a majority party just doing what it likes and 36% of the vote is pretty old-fashioned. So actually working cross-party is no bad thing.
Stephen Gethins of the SNP, thanks for joining us from Dundee.
Thanks, Nick.